Does operating your own homestead and growing your own food or raising animals for food automatically guarantee better or optimal health outcomes? I don't think so, and in this video I'll explain why. So here is the thing, we came into the homesteading game relatively late. Our journey into health and wellness actually started in the dietary field by cutting out processed sugars or added sugars, experimenting with a paleo, ketogenic, carnivore, and then animal-based diet. But along the way, we realized that nutrition is one part, but certainly not the only one or only factor that's important for optimal health. So we've started focusing more on sleep quality, on the avoidance of environmental toxins, stress management, hormetic stressors like sauna bathing and cold plunging, red light therapy, etc., etc. So all of the things that a lot of the biohackers pay attention to in an attempt to improve the health and well-being. At some point we realized, well, we're doing a lot of things right. We're eating grass-fed, grass-finished, etc., etc. But we realized that one thing that's missing is taking better control of our food supply. And that's when we decided that we want to raise our own animals and plant a garden and grow and raise some of the food we consume as much as possible. That's when we started homesteading. And as we did this, we realized two things. One was that there are two distinct silos. There is the biohacking side and there is the homesteading side. And the biohacking side, for the most part, they do a lot of things right. They pay a lot of attention to all of the things that are important, but most biohackers don't raise their own food. That was one thing. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we realized that most homesteaders have a fairly poor understanding of all of the other things that go into improving your health and well-being. I've not seen a whole lot of homesteaders that are into red light therapy and sauna bathing and all of those things. I mean, there are obviously some, but the majority, I want to say, focus on growing their own food and, being connected to the land and doing all of the things that are important. But they are missing pieces of that puzzle on both sides. And I realized that there's got to be a disconnect because most homesteaders don't necessarily look like warriors, and most biohackers, some of which do look like warriors, have no control or limited control over the food supply. So we kind of have to bring those things together. And that's what inspired us to really think about health and wellness from a more holistic, primal perspective, trying to incorporate as many of the primal principles into our modern life. And a couple of things that we realized is that just by growing your own food doesn't necessarily mean the laws of physics and the laws of human metabolism no longer apply. And there are two specific examples that I want to point out that I think a lot of homesteaders are missing. And that is, just because you grow a certain type of food yourself doesn't necessarily make it healthy. Just one example, spinach, many leafy greens, but spinach and kale in particular are incredibly high in oxalates. One of the many plant-based antinutrients that can significantly and negatively impact your health. Now, if you only eat the spinach you're growing or only eat the kale you're growing, you probably have a somewhat limited exposure to those plants. It's certainly different having spinach during the growing season and then not for the rest of the year, whereas going to the store and throwing spinach into your green smoothie every single day because you think it's such a superfood. It is not. If you were to preserve your spinach or kale, I don't know if that's even possible, we don't eat that stuff, but let's say, for the sake of argument, you grow your own spinach and you have it year round, you would suffer the same health consequences by doing that than if you were, to not grow that spinach and buy it in the store. Is your spinach maybe a little bit better, maybe because it has fewer pesticides or what have you? Sure. But most of the pesticides we consume are actually the plant's natural pesticides that are in the plant and not the ones we spray on. So, that's just one of the examples. The second example is, and that's really hits, home to a degree, is sourdough. If you look at Instagram, and YouTube, etc., especially following the channels that are where the hosts are females, it's all about baking and sourdough and how sourdough is so much better. And even on the biohacking side, that is kind of, seeped over a little bit, where biohackers now talk about that sourdough bread is not the same as regular bread and how it's so much healthier and better for you. And while I don't discount the benefits of sourdough in comparison to regular bread, it's still grains at the end of the day, and grains are not optimal food for humans. It doesn't matter if you ferment them and pray to them or do whatever it takes, to kind of make them better. You can get them better, but it's still not optimal food for humans. And we did an experiment, just my wife and I, because my wife has noticed if she eats like I eat, her body changes, and not for the better, you know. So there is already, you know, something that doesn't apply to everyone, you know. And the prime example was sourdough in our case, because we also jumped on the sourdough bandwagon. And my wife started making sourdough, you know, now baked once a week. And, you know, then we had sourdough pizza and sourdough pancakes with this cart and sourdough bread and, you know, sourdough. And our consumption of sourdough increased from not eating any grains whatsoever, because they are not part of a Paleolithic or even animalist, and certainly not a part of a keto. So none of the dietary frameworks that we followed for many years would include grains. And so then we started including sourdough because, well, you know, if you ferment the grains, you get rid of some of the anti-nutrients, you reduce the glycemic index, and it's suddenly healthy, right? Or so no, I didn't really think that, but so we hoped, let's put it that way. And so we slept on a continuous glucose monitor, you know, my wife and I, and she noticed that just having one slice of rustic sourdough bread, double fermented, the whole 9 yards, it significantly spiked her blood sugar, and that blood sugar remained elevated for 2.5 hours. That's not a good thing if that happens daily or on a, you know, chronic basis. Whereas if I consume a slice of sourdough, and in particular if I consume it after having my protein and my fat, I have a very minimal impact. You know, I can eat several slices without getting the same response she would get from one slice. And that was just one example where she realizes, well, you know, sourdough is not working for me. The second thing is raw milk. You know, many people agree that raw milk is a superfood, is the best, you know, of the best. Everyone can have raw milk. Maybe not. That's not the case, because we've realized, or my wife again has realized, poor her, because she's pretty upset that her body responds differently to many of those quote unquote healthy foods that are so popular in the homesteading world than I do. And so if she drinks raw milk, you know, A2 from a local farm here, quality-wise, likely the best you can do, unless, you know, you milk the cow yourself, she gets really bad breath from just having a glass of milk. And so evidently, I would argue that if you suddenly start smelling bad, if, you know, your breath is bad, your skin breaks out, you feel funky, your body, you can tell if your body is responding well to the food you're eating or not, at least if you're somewhat in tune with your body. And she evidently does not respond well to raw milk. She does not respond well to sourdough, whereas I can have those things and I seem to be fine. Now, I'm not arguing that those are necessarily optimal foods for me, that I can have them in unlimited amounts and I don't have to worry about eating meat because I can only do milk and sourdough. I'm not saying this because I don't think that to be true. I still believe that the best foods for humans are animals nose to tail. Everything else, there is nuance to that, and you'll have to figure out if and how much you can have of other things. But that was just one example. The sourdough, everyone is on the sourdough bandwagon. Sourdough is still not optimal food for humans. You might be able to get away with it in certain amounts, but it's definitely not a blanket statement. Everyone can have sourdough, and it might be terrible for you. The second example, and that's maybe more resonating with you, is growing your own or raising your own chickens, right? That's fairly popular. Chickens are easy to raise. And, you know, a lot of people think that, well, you know, I can do it fairly inexpensive and it's healthy. Those birds are great. And so let's raise chickens for meat and eat predominantly chicken meat. Well, here is the thing. Most homesteaders, especially those who raise them in a commercial setting, but also those who just raise them for their own food consumption, raise Cornish cross. And I've mentioned this in a different video. Cornish cross are absolute junk food. You know, is a Cornish cross raised by you on your own land healthier than one you can buy in the store? Arguably so, but healthier does not make it healthy. Cornish cross is a terrible junk food product. You're eating obese babies that is absolutely not ideal for human health. And especially if you then combine that with a less than ideal diet. You know, even if you buy organic, if that feed you're feeding your chickens is high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, and that's typically the case if you feed, even if it's organic, if you feed that contains soy and corn and that has vegetable oils that bind the minerals, many of the fertile, you know, nutrient powders that feed mills mix with the grains uses vegetable oils. Vegetable oils oxidize quickly, they become rancid quickly, and they're high in linoleic acid, one of the highly inflammatory omega-6 or polyunsaturated fatty acids that we try to stay away from by not using vegetable oils, by using butter and lard and tallow and ghee for cooking instead of vegetable oils, right? And so monogastric animals are what they eat. So if you feed your chickens organic but high PUFA feed, well, those high PUFAs are going to end up in the meat and in the fat of the animal that you then consume, and you get as sick as this Cornish cross was before it was butchered. Now, raising your own Cornish cross is still not ideal. You know, you want to raise, first of all, monogastric animals are never as nutritious as their ruminant counterparts. You know, so you can raise cattle or finish cattle on grain, resulting in significantly better, healthier, and more nutritious meat than the best chickens you can raise on the best possible diet. But if you do chickens, then you know you gotta raise them on a low PUFA feed. You know, that's super expensive, and you need to raise a breed that is not a Cornish cross, so a slower growing breed. And those two factors combined already make commercial chicken production not feasible, because nobody would pay $50 for a bird, and you know it's likely going to cost you that much, plus you know with your profit margin to raise a chicken, a proper type of chicken with a proper feed responsibly, so it's healthier, significantly healthier than the best Cornish cross you can raise. So that's a second example where most homesteaders don't really understand that just because they're raising their own Cornish cross, you know, on pasture or whatever, does not make them ideal food for humans. You know, it's better, but better is not good, you know, if that makes sense. And so those are just two examples where I want to point out that, you know, homesteading is great. You need to take control of your food supply, but you also need to know a lot of the other things that might not be well known in the homesteading silo. You know, you need to look a little bit, you know, past the homesteading, the realm of homesteading, you know, think a little bit about, okay, human metabolism and some of the things that the biohacking world is doing and teaching to kind of figure out how can you make your homestead work in a way that actually significantly improves your health, so you don't end up with a big belly, even though you're farming and you're eating everything from your land. Because if you're doing all of those things, shouldn't you be healthy, metabolically healthy with a low body fat percentage, etc.? If you're not, then there is something missing, I would argue. And the nuance to that is, I think, you know, if you look at my grandparents and their parents, you know, they were farmers too, and they were not obese or overweight, you know, and my grandma and my granddad as well, they're still alive, they're in their 90s now. They're now suffering from some of the chronic conditions that are the result of poor lifestyle choices in their later years that they just didn't know any better. But at least in the beginning, you know, there was nobody in that family who was overweight or obese. And I would argue that's likely because farming back in the days was significantly different than it is today. There weren't necessarily no tractors, you know, they had to move a lot of the stuff by hand. They were active, they had to, you know, they were wiped out at the end of the day. In our case, with our homestead, you know, doing the chores and taking care of the animals is not a whole lot of manual labor. You know, yes, it is better than sitting in front of the computer and recording this video, obviously, but it's still nowhere near as intense, physically speaking, as it was back in the days. And back in the days, they also didn't have, you know, depending on, you know, when they lived and where and at what time, maybe electricity was still, you know, a problem. Maybe, you know, blue light was different because they had incandescent lights and not the LEDs that emit predominantly blue light. You know, there were a lot of things different than they are today. So just replicating what your grandmother did in the modern context might not lead to the same health outcomes. You need to do a little bit more if you want to maintain your modern lifestyle to stay healthy. And that includes understanding that raising your own food does not necessarily mean that you have optimal health outcomes. You need to pay attention to what you're raising. You need to understand that all plants have defense chemicals that you either want to mitigate or avoid entirely. You need to figure out that, or need to understand that chicken meat has never been a staple of human diet. You know, chickens ended up in the pot to make stock or whatever if they were done laying. Nobody 60 or 100 years ago would raise chickens for meat because those chickens did not have enough meat. You know, only our modern crosses that have been bred specifically to be slaughtered at a baby age. You know, we are eating obese babies with those Cornish cross that are absolutely not healthy, that cannot walk properly, that cannot reproduce. Do you really want to eat something that's sick from the get-go? I do not, you know. And so those are the considerations I think you should not forget, because you might be missing out on an important aspect of health and wellness. And despite everything that you're doing and raising your own food, you might still end up with less than ideal health outcomes, with autoimmune issues, with a lot of other things that can be avoided by having the appropriate knowledge and by applying that to your lifestyle. So I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't agree or don't agree with some of what I said or all of what I said, let me know in the comments. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Until next time.